The following year in Barcelona, the subject of the exhibition is the audience. And the basic plan is to erect a huge audience of 1,000 seats all over the city of Barcelona, which will be strategically placed for simply watching the city, both in detail and in general manifestation. The next exhibition is going to be on the condition of our attitude towards acting and the illusion of presentation of archetypes, certainly in terms of the cinema and also in the theatre and also in terms of painting. And the fifth exhibition, which is already in preparation in Tokyo, will discuss the use of the property, the prop, in terms of theatre and of cinema. My general approach or ambition with this exhibition is to consider, I suppose, in the decade of the 1990s, when cinema comes of age, although I think some of us might actually argue, has cinema come of age yet? And I would say no, that cinema is still a very, very primitive and unsophisticated art, which hasn't even reached its Cubist period yet. But that again is part of the debate that I want to have in association with these exhibitions. The other 5 parts of the exhibition will be happening. Again, preparations have begun, but we haven't realized the locations absolutely yet. But we should be going to Beijing and Hong Kong and Sydney, possibly to Rome, certainly maybe to Melbourne. Toronto are interested, and finally the last exhibition, which we hope to take place in the year 2000, will happen in New York. So you can see that the exhibitions themselves are almost vaingloriously ambitious, and I think for me the difference is, in terms of my attitude towards filmmaking and this concern, is to make them very egalitarian, to make them very interactive. They are essentially about cinematic presentation of imagery, but they are exhibitions which exist in site-specific areas with a huge collaboration of large numbers of people.
In each city, in each country...
Manifestations in Geneva are very much to do with an architectural proposition of actually putting up 100 staircases to make a frame. But in each particular case, there will be a variation on that theme. So there's no way that we're going to take the 100 staircases to other cities. There will be other, and I hope equally interesting, manifestations to do with design and architecture.
I would like to extend an invitation for you to come to Jerusalem. 1996 will be 3,000 years of the city of David. And this is the city where all religions meet. The subjects are enormous. Would you consider it?
I would be very happy to welcome your invitation. It is maybe interesting that I think Geneva, even for all my Genevan friends, would have to accept it's not exactly one of the big art capitals of the world. But I think it's a very useful and interesting place to begin a series of exhibitions like this. Geneva is still a pedestrian city. You can still walk around it within about an hour. Can you imagine a manifestation like this in Paris or London? There's a way that the sheer scope of the urbanistic way in which these cities are organized would make it very problematical. So I think in the outline that I've mentioned, you can see there's a gradual desire to make a bigger and bigger and bigger space. Also, of course, Geneva is the seat of Calvinism, which is just one minute particle.
Di Ginevra c'era anche dell'ironia, nel senso, io faccio il fotografo ed è normale che la gente abbia la curiosità di guardare attraverso il mirino della macchina fotografica. Molta gente chiede: posso guardare? Mi sembrava che ci fosse su questa vostra operazione forse anche questa ironia del consumo che c'è per esempio anche da parte delle guide turistiche che portano tutta la gente in un posto, dice di guardare tutti e tutti si mettono a fotografare nella stessa direzione. Ecco, volevo solo capire, non criticare.
I was trained, my career began as a painter, and great concern I think for anybody who's seen my cinema is to use the language and aesthetics of 2,000 years of the manufacture of images and to try and utilize that in a rich and sophisticated way as possible into the cinema. Some people would say that there are contrary and opposite antagonisms between these two traditions which will never meet. I would disagree. I think there is a very serious way in which the cinema is a natural heir to 2,000 years of image making. One of the most important things which I think is very self-evident, I would like to believe, about this film is its concentration almost to a fetishistic degree about the frame. How is it for the last 400 years, certainly since the Renaissance, all constructed drama is seen through a frame, starting essentially with the proscenium arch of the theatre, developing very much through painting, of course, certainly with the cinema itself, and certainly with that little wretched cinema screen now which is called television. It is particularly interesting, I think, that the aspect ratio and the control of the frame has got tighter and tighter and tighter. As a filmmaker, I still do have the possibility of choosing at least one of 5 ratios to make a cinema film. But with television, and let's for the moment conveniently forget high definition because there's a new format and ratio beginning to appear on the horizon, television basically all over the world is restricted to the same aspect frame ratio of 1 to 1.33. I think, in general terms, that if a system becomes tighter and tighter and tighter, it reaches a saturation point and we have to explode it. And I think that next year, 1995, is particularly interesting in that respect because it could mean the end of the frame. If you think about technological inventions like virtual reality, which does not need a frame, you think of Omnimax and IMAX, where the frame is so big, it's beyond the periphery of vision. If you look at what's been happening in the last 30 years in painting, certainly since American pop art, there has been an explosion of the frame. Maybe it's significant that 1995 is in fact to break down finally this straitjacket of the concept of the frame which has ruled the way in which we've seen the constructed image for the last 400 years. There is a way in which this film both celebrates but also becomes perhaps totally obsessed with the frameness of the frame in order to constantly tell you, the audience, and of course in dialogue I would very much like to think between me and you as maker and audience, about haven't we had enough of this frame? What are the potentialities that we can explore anymore? How can we develop the concept of this rectangular box which has been so omnipresent in the manufacture images for so long? So there is a way in which by multiplying, by taking it to absurd lengths, to pushing it ad nauseam, I want to make that consciousness very much apparent. Because after all, there is no frame in nature. It's an artificial device. It is in some ways not at all relevant or analogous to the human vision. There is in some senses no straight line in nature. So it's part again of that series of artifices, series of conceptual devices which civilization creates for itself in order to organize chaos. And I know that sounds incredibly grandiose and simplistic, but I suspect basically that most of my cinema are about these sorts of phenomena. So although this is a television film, although this is a film, shall we say, which deals in factions as opposed to fictions, it is still very, very subjective. It is still very much part and parcel of the general cinematic approach. I remember when the exhibition opened in Geneva, a little child made the report that he climbed the staircase, looked through the viewing finder, and said there was nothing there. And that to me exactly epitomizes the worthwhileness of doing a project like that, because there's everything there. But that child, of course, is responding to educational ways of the concept of what should be contained within a frame. He's a television child, a post-television child. And I think that that is a sure indication that all of us, in some senses, are trained to be highly literate, but our abilities and our sensibilities and our training in terms of seeing and viewing are remarkably backward. So again, it's part of the ongoing program, which I would like to be associated with, in some senses, to suggest that cinema should really, and television should really be a visual medium, and so much of the material that we get in cinema and television is not that at all. I suppose in some ways this film that we've made in Geneva harks right back to the first public film which I ever showed here in competition in the Venice Film Festival, which was a movie called The Draftsman's Contract, where a man again was obsessed with what happened within the frame and the metaphorical concerns about what could be described in the American frame of a frame-up. Every time we go to the cinema, we become victims of a frame-up. I think very much hope to investigate concepts of the Baroque with a capital B and also with a small b. It's now almost a cliche to suggest we are now in another Baroque age, an age of excess, of sensation, of illusionism. And in that film, The Baby of Macon, I was very determined to make a comparison between the 17th century notion of the Baroque, which is basically a form of illusionistic propaganda for Roman Catholicism, and make references, I hope, to an audience that cinema, again, is a propaganda medium, not so much now, of course, with the minutiae of a certain religion, but we could say that cinema is a propaganda medium for capitalism, constantly making references about insiders, outsiders, power blocks, superstition, faith, and all those concatenations of the Baroque, in a sense, because after all, the very center of the 17th century Baroque, there is nothing. Go to St. Peter's in Rome and look at what Bernini did at the East End. It's just a question of light, color, atmosphere, and again, those definitions can be exactly posited at the very heart of cinema. What is there? Nothing. Huge shadows, illusionism. So I think there are lots and lots of very fascinating references backwards and forwards about the whole concept of what the Baroque is.
Have you already got an idea of what about doing in Rome if you manage to bring the STEMS project there?
I have to be careful because I've already had certain problems in Rome already. We were supposed to be making a manifestation at Piazza del Popolo this spring, but for all reasons of politics, unfortunately, that manifestation never happened. So I'm sure you can understand if I say my lips should be sealed for the moment. The possibility of returning to Earth again, I would much prefer to come down next time as an architect rather than as a filmmaker. There is and always has seemed to me to be a great, huge possibilities of intermediality, of universality about architecture, and also the responsibility of the architect seems to be much more significant than the responsibility of the filmmaker. So I'm particularly interested in your question. I think because of all the new technologies, because of the ways and means in which information is now processed and passed on, that there indeed could be enormous excitements about the interpenetration, if you like, between filmic documentary traditions and architecture. Ideas of illusionistic cities, ideas of cities which are entirely made of light. There are some most extraordinary developments now happening in terms of light projection and light organization, and a renewed interest in architects to consider the city by night in terms of artificial light. And I think all that area, which can be so very well manifest by concepts of projection, concepts of light. I, as a filmmaker, in a traditional feature-length proposition of a manufacturing filmmaker, am very frustrated by the notion of only being allowed to make 2-hour films. I want to make 4-hour films, 6-hour films, 24-hour films, 48-hour films, 3-year-long films. But you can see how the proposition mocks itself. Could I ever find the money to do it? Could I ever find an audience who was interested in this proposition to actually watch what I made? But I think one of the satisfactions about this exhibition, not only is it totally interactive in a public sense, because it exists 24 hours a day in the streets for everybody to be associated with, and that means when it's raining, when the light is bad, when the light is good, when there are crowds of people, when it's completely empty, because you can imagine a situation like that no single second will ever be the same. Unlike film, which is highly predictable. When you look at a film, it's always the same, which somehow seems to be, sadly for me, inapposite. So what I was able here to do in Geneva was, in a sense, to make 100 day-long films. Now, there's no way I could make a film of that process, for the reasons we just mentioned. So this rather strange concept of trying at least to taste each one of these sites has been represented, of course, in miniature, in microcosm, by just allowing the arbitrary 60 seconds visit to each one of the sites. But I'm deeply aware of the contradictions of time and pace and sequence. And I think, I would like to imagine, that the sheer sort of John Cagean minimalist approach to structuring this information Whether the picture is interesting or not interesting, whatever its values are, it's always given an exactly equal amount of time. And I think as a proposition for filmmaking, therefore not being associated with narrative, not being associated with all those other conventional structures which we associate with dominant cinema, here can be allowed a certain freedom in which to breathe. I know some of you might find it infinitely boring, but I think the tedium or the repetition or the sense, a very strong sense of structure is part of the experience of watching this film. Sorry, that was an ad-lib statement. How about the lady in the middle?
Phil, because the way the exhibition was done was very accessible to the people in Geneva, to the tourists who come to Geneva. With a film that can be shown to millions all over the world. So there is something to be said for film.
One of the particular ways I'd like this film to be seen also is to be imagined as 100 one-minute films to be seen over a period of 100 days. Because sometimes I think this film makes extremely high demands on your concentration. And if it was seen as a series of like 100 haiku, 100 little snippets of intense information with a lot of space around it, that might also be a way of appreciating and coming to grips with the ideas that are being expressed.
All this means that you are no longer doing fiction, is that?
Not at all, no, I would never want to give up the big screen. And we are starting a new picture in Japan in next January. If I am not there, because I'm constantly traveling, if you speak to my assistant, whose name is Eliza, I'm sure she'll I think probably we are extremely busy. We're about to make an opera in Amsterdam, so I think probably the best time to approach us would maybe about April of next year. Is that too far away? Or maybe how about the latter end, just before Christmas?
Do you think you will become an Italy?
I can't foresee any projects that would bring me here probably before next year. But after the debacle of Rome, we now have a standing invitation to take our exhibition manifestation to 7 other Italian cities. So in a sense, even though that exhibition didn't happen, there's been an explosion of proliferation of other possibilities.
Okay, 7 o'clock tomorrow morning?
Is that too early for you?
No. This is my and the Jerusalem Film Festival, where we screened all your films all the time and invite you to make it.
Okay, thank you very much.
In Jerusalem could be fantastic.
People say that you're also a novel writer. Why your novels we can't...
I never thought anybody would want to read them.
I read anything you write.
All right.
I have your screenplays.
Maybe too.
Any page.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Hi. Thank you. Yes.